Buongiorno. Peter and I are delighted to be here to present Lab-Grown Marketing, the 10 synthetic advantages. We're here to talk about the 3 main challenges AI is going to help marketers solve: research, strategy, and tactics.
Now, this idea of lab-grown substitutes or synthetic substitutes, it sounds like a very futuristic idea, but it's actually a pretty old idea. And if you look at the past 100 years, what you'll find is that synthetic substitutes have revolutionized countless industries. Let's start with vanilla. Once upon a time, vanilla was a luxury spice for kings and queens. And then early scientists, they figured out how to make synthetic vanilla. Now every kitchen cabinet in the world has synthetic vanilla in it. Same thing happened with rubber. In World War II, the Allies needed to rapidly scale up rubber production. Growing rubber on trees was not particularly scalable. And then scientists figured out how to manufacture synthetic rubber. Then you've got diamonds, a famous example. Diamonds, of course, the most precious object that money can buy. And eventually, in the 1950s, GE figured out how to grow diamonds in labs. And now most diamonds are actually lab-grown diamonds.
Then you also will see things like, for example, synthetic insulin. Synthetic insulin started as a human or an animal product, and now it's entirely synthetic, and everybody in the world will use insulin.
In each of these cases, these lab-grown substitutes have transformed various industries. What's happening now is the arrival of lab-grown marketing or synthetic marketing, and that's made possible by the arrival of generative AI.
And our belief is that this has happened in products ranging from vanilla to diamonds. It hasn't really happened in marketing yet. Maybe to the degree it's happened in marketing at all, it's really only happened in copywriting. And in fact, we believe everything in marketing is going to change. Synthetic marketing is going to be radically better than man-made marketing or real marketing, however you want to call it. And it's going to make marketers essentially superhuman in their ability to produce better marketing plans with voice of customer at the center. We believe that this is going to happen, this revolution is going to happen in 3 core places. First, it's going to happen in research. We're going to better understand your customer and build better marketing plans with better objectives. Second, it's going to happen in strategy. There's all sorts of strategic decisions or strategic needs that are going to be serviced by synthetic marketing. And then finally, tactically, there's all sorts of places like copywriting, for example, that synthetic is going to be better when it comes to tactics. So you're going to see synthetic is going to make marketing research, marketing strategy, and marketing tactics better than they used to be. We're actually going to walk you through 10 specific trends with a fun story that opens to explain the idea, and then show you how ultimately in the strategic or tactical way, that's going to change marketing. So there'll be 10 trends. There's going to be 4 in research. There's going to be 3 in strategy. There'll be 3 in tactics. That's the 10 trends. And that's going to be the story we tell today about why synthetic is better. We're going to start with the first category we think that synthetic research, synthetic marketing will change, and that's going to be the research category.
Our first trend is called the empty chair. Legend has it, at Amazon, Jeff Bezos insists that in every meeting, one chair is left open, the empty chair. And that empty chair is supposed to represent the customer. And whenever you're making a decision at Amazon, you're supposed to look at that chair and ask yourself, what would the customer want us to do? And that's what helps Amazon maintain a customer-centric perspective. But there is a reason the chair is empty, and that's because it would be deeply impractical to actually talk to a customer every time you're trying to make a decision at a company. That's the problem with market research. It just doesn't scale very well. Actually, we did a synthetic survey on this of 1,000 CMOs to try to ask them how often do they really use the voice of the customer when making a decision. What we found is that about 90% of marketers in B2B and B2C, they skip rigorous quantitative research altogether. And most of the decisions are really made based on vibes. Now, why do people skip traditional market research? The reasons vary. In B2B, it's usually because it's so hard to actually get a sample. These are very hard to reach audiences, highly paid professionals, not that many of them on the planet, hard to get them to take a survey. So 61% of B2B marketers say getting a sample is actually the #1 barrier. But at the end of the day, you need some sort of information to make a decision. So what do you fall back on? In B2B, you usually fall back on sales. Something like 72% of the time, the B2B marketer just goes to the sales department, asks what they think the company should do. And sales is very valuable, but sales is not the customer. They have a very warped view of the customer. There really is no substitute for the customer. Only the customer can be the voice of the customer. But that's all about to change with AI. Because now what you can do is you can have lab-grown customers or synthetic customers, like Michael here. Now, who is Michael? Michael is not a real person. Michael is AI impersonating a person, and a person with very, very particular characteristics. So you can see Michael is a CIO at a large technology company. So that's his seniority, his company size, and his industry. Those are his B2B characteristics. But Michael also has a whole tranche of B2C characteristics. Like, he's 52 years old. He makes over $1 million a year. He likes amateur astronomy. Who doesn't? So this is a very detailed and very specific customer built through AI. Now, what can you actually do with these lab-grown customers? Well, you can do quantitative and qualitative research. For qualitative research, you should actually get a focus group together and ask for different perspectives on a topic. Here you can see, asking a synthetic panel about 401k providers. And you can see the perspective of Monica, who's a director of compensation at a big financial services company. And she's telling you how important it is to have education resources available to employees. But then you might ask yourself, okay, is that just one person's perspective? Is that everyone's perspective? What does the sort of whole sample think? And that's where you can then do synthetic quantitative research. So you can field a quantitative study to 1,000 synthetic customers and ask them, hey, what is important when you're deciding on a new 401k provider? And what you can see here in the data is the relative importance of different features. So you can see, for example, having more transparent fees is about 4 times more important than having personalized educational resources. So that qualitative and quantitative synthetic research is ultimately helping you understand, how should I market this 401k solution?
I think what's really interesting and exciting about this idea on the empty chair is in B2B, there practically has not been voice of customer. 72% of marketers are going to sales to get voice of customer. So there's no such thing as voice of customer. There's voice of sales instead. And now AI makes it possible for the first time, maybe ever, to actually have voice of customer in B2B. Trend number 2 is called the cost of curiosity. And we're going to start by looking at the synthetic diamond market, which, as you may recall, is so good and so cheap now that everyone's upset about it. And what you see here is that the cost of a lab-grown diamond is going down. And as a result, the growth rates are going up. And this is quite common. This is what happens when a product becomes more accessible, more refined. It's just easier to buy more of it, and people demand more and more and more of it, which is what you see in the chart here on the right. People are buying more and more synthetic diamonds. Interestingly, this tends to start in B2B first, like it did with GE in 1954, and then it moves to consumer markets over time. So starting in B2B is usually a very good place for synthetic products.
So now let's talk about market research. Historically, because market research was so expensive, it was reserved for only the biggest brands. And even at the biggest brands, it was only used to inform the biggest decisions, like what new brand should we launch? What new product should we bring to market? What market should we enter next? These are huge strategic decisions, and only for those types of decisions did it make sense to field a very expensive quantitative survey. Just like diamonds used to be reserved for mining companies, market research used to be reserved for only the biggest companies. Now even small brands will be able to use market research to make big decisions. You can see an example here of a company trying to understand how to message their product to the C-suite, which is something a small brand could never afford to run a survey like this in the past.
Because the cost to ask questions is going way down, it means you can ask way more questions. So of course you're going to ask questions like this. You're going to ask, if I had to describe my value prop to the CEO or the board in one sentence, how should I frame it, right? Because obviously you want your customer to be able to go into the board, go into the CEO and say, it's all about cost, or it's all about collaboration, or it's all about efficiency. So of course you're going to do very substantive, very real research like this to better position your product. But because the cost has come way down, you're going to ask lots of other questions that you probably wouldn't have asked in the past. Now you're going to ask those for the first time. So for example, you may ask a question around, we've got an after party at our upcoming event. Should we name the after party ERP party, or should we name it supply chain and champagne? Now, I would have chosen supply chain and champagne, but here you can see the data shows that ERP party would actually be the winner. I think in these kinds of smaller decisions, you can choose to trust the data or trust your gut, but the point is you can ask these questions now for the first time and get real data around it, which is quite enlightening and quite wonderful.
Trend number 3 is called the hallucination problem. Now, people are very, very skeptical of AI. It's easy to convince people that it's faster and cheaper, but marketers are very skeptical that the results are actually accurate when it comes to synthetic research. Jon and I have encountered lots of skepticism as we scaled Evidenza. I remember one time presenting to a very skeptical audience of agency people. And there was this one guy in particular, super skeptic, who was just constantly trying to poke holes in the data. So he had me ask a very specific question. He wanted me to ask a synthetic German person whether they had heard of Toto toilets. So the response came back from the synthetic German and said, yeah, I've heard of Toto toilets. Actually, I recently was going to remodel my home. I was thinking of using Toto toilets, but I decided against it because it was too expensive. The skeptic was euphoric. He jumped in and he was like, see, gotcha. That's totally wrong because actually, Toto toilets, the Japanese brand, is only known in Japan. It's only sold in Japan. Now, I thought this was very interesting because I live in Brooklyn and actually I have a Toto toilet and I have heard of Toto toilets. So the point is the marketer thought the machine was hallucinating, but actually it was the marketer who was hallucinating. The marketer thought Toto was only sold in Japan when actually it's sold in markets all around the world. This is a really important concept to understand. When it comes to synthetic research, people are often wondering, is it as perfectly accurate as traditional market research? And the key thing to understand is that traditional market research is plagued with all kinds of accuracy problems. You can see here a chart from Kantar, of all places, talking about the relative scale of different issues in market research. What you can see is that fraud is a very big problem in market research, so people pretending to be people who they're not in order to get paid and in order to capture the incentive. But that's actually not the biggest source of waste in market research. The biggest accuracy problem is concentration. And that once you ask people 60 research questions, they may be very focused on the first question and getting that right. But by question 30 and 40 and 50, their attention starts to lag, they start to get sloppy, and their answers start to actually become less and less accurate. They start to degrade. So market research is not 100% accurate. There is an error margin, and you need to factor that in when you're doing human market research. There is this meme in the industry that AI is constantly hallucinating. But what you actually find is that these AI companies have very rigorous eval frameworks that they use to figure out how likely is the machine to hallucinate and how can we reduce hallucination rates over time. So here you can see a very famous chart from Vectara where they're actually measuring the hallucination rates of different large language models. And that you can see actually across the board, hallucination rates are pretty low. They're below 4%. In some cases, they're 1%. But the key thing to understand is that it's getting better and better and better through evals, which means they look at the right answer, they look at the LLM answer, and then they figure out how to optimize the system over time so that the accuracy rate goes up. We've actually been doing something very, very similar with synthetic market research. So we will take the human responses to a survey and we will compare them to the synthetic answers on a survey. What you can see here is a 20-question survey, and you can see we've run multiple models at multiple configurations, multiple different times, in order to measure the correlation between the synthetic and human responses. Everything in a light, lovely color of yellow is a very high correlation, above 0.7. The darker blue is lower correlation, like 0.2, for example. What you can see is actually the correlations are quite high across the board. But what this system of evals helps you do is refine your model over time to get higher and higher levels of accuracy.
This idea of hallucinations is well known, well understood, and there's actually benchmarks, evals that track this. And they look at for specific models. You ask them a question, and then you fact check it. What percentage will be factually incorrect? What percentage of answers? And in fact, what you see here is like the best models now are close to 1% of answers are factually incorrect. Again, with humans, it's something like 10 to 13%. So there is a hallucination problem. It's probably 10x bigger in humans than it is in leading models today. So this ought to just help you think about what's really the problem with hallucinations and where does it exist. And the truth is that this is only going to get better and better and better among quantitative research with AI, right? Because they're tracking it and they're going to improve it. That same thing cannot be done with humans. Humans aren't going to get any better at this problem. So humans are going to get worse and worse and worse, whereas AI is going to get better and better and better. Now we're going to talk about trend number 4, the zero risk zone.
Now, as we've discussed, it's very hard to even get the budget for market research, but when you do, sometimes things go even worse for you. Sometimes you spend $300,000 on a survey, you'll go and you'll present it to your executive team, and they'll start looking at each other like, wait a second, how much did we pay for this research, which is telling us some incredibly obvious thing like water is wet? Now, all of a sudden, you're in the hot seat because they're starting to wonder, how have you been spending the company's resources? And all of a sudden, your job is in jeopardy. And this really gets to this idea of the research risk triangle.
Risk number 1 is legal risk. Risk number 2 is professional risk. And risk number 3 is reputational risk. Those are the 3 big risks you get when about to run market research.
Risk number 1 is the legal risk. You're dealing with PII, personally identifiable information, which means all of a sudden you have to jump through a ton of legal and regulatory hoops in order to field the research, especially if you're in a highly regulated category like the pharmaceutical industry. You get that wrong, you can actually expose your company to legal risk.
Professional risk, the second risk. You've put your company in legal harm, you've put your company in reputational harm. Well, you might lose your job now. That's professional or personal risk.
And last but not least, there's reputational risk. Sometimes the types of questions you want to ask your customers, you don't actually want your customers to know that you're even thinking about rebranding the company or launching a new product. You're worried that information is going to get out. It's going to be shared with the rest of your customers. They're going to take a picture of an ad in a focus group and share it with the New York Times. So now you're dealing with legal risk, professional risk, and reputational risk.
So those are the 3 big risks you might incur if you don't stress test it first with AI to figure out what's the riskiest idea in here, how can we communicate it more clearly, how can we remove any sorts of objections or problems. So all these ideas should be stress tested first. They should be simulated first. Get the bad feedback then. So essentially break the narrative in the lab, don't break it in the markets.
One of the most interesting use cases Jon and I have seen is actually earnings calls. Earnings calls tend to contain very, very sensitive information. And if you get an earning call wrong, if your CEO uses the wrong turn of phrase on the earnings call, $1 billion can be evaporated off of your market capitalization, right? But people don't usually pre-test earnings calls because the information is so sensitive. With synthetic research, you could actually build a synthetic sample of financial analysts, and you could test 10 different versions of your earnings call to figure out which one's going to have the best effect on the stock price and which ones are going to have the worst effect on the stock price. If only the CEO of Twilio had had this capability a couple of years ago when he used a very poor choice of words and completely tanked the valuation of Twilio. The synthetic sample could actually not just identify problematic phrases, but suggest new, better phrases. So, for example, saying profitability is now our top focus lands much better than saying, we're shifting our focus or we're focused on cutting costs.
Now we're going to talk about category number 2, strategy, and how you will choose the right path to victory. We're going to talk about trend number 5. And trend number 5 is called the Pocket PhD. It's important to understand that marketing effectiveness has effectively been decoded. Ehrenberg Bass has done tons of research in the consumer world, how brands grow, building distinctive brand assets, category entry points that really give you the laws of growth for consumer categories. We then replicated that when we used to be at LinkedIn with Ehrenberg Bass, looking at how B2B brands grow. So there's just lots of marketing science that is freely available in blog posts and papers and reports that can essentially help you to understand how your category grows.
These are really, really important ideas, but they're often trapped inside these very dense, difficult to read books. So the truth is there's been a real revolution in marketing, but the revolution was not televised, and most of us in marketing have no idea that any of this even happened, right? Jon and I learned this the hard way at LinkedIn. We spent about 5 years just learning these principles. That's how many hours it took of reading and rereading the books, talking to the professors, and we were very lucky. We had the time and resources to actually do that. Then we had to spend practically another 5 years actually putting those principles into practice. As an example, there's the 95-5 rule. The 95-5 rule is a truly revolutionary concept in marketing science, which says that at any given time, something like 95% of the buyers are not actively in the market, only 5% are. And that actually brands grow by marketing to the 95% so that they think of your brand when they ultimately go into the market. But critics of the 95-5 rule have always pointed out that this is a very broad general model. The truth is, in different categories, the 95-5 split may be very, very different. But now with AI, what you can do is actually apply the 95-5 rule to your specific brand. So what Jon and I did here is we took John Dawes' survey and we fielded it to thousands of synthetic customers in different categories to figure out what is the 95-5 split in ERP versus CRM, or in B2C, what is it on toothpaste versus cars? And what you can actually start to see is that different categories have very different purchase periods. So with ERP, it's purchased only once every 8 years on average, whereas in CRM, it's purchased every 3 years in average, which means in a given quarter, far more people are in market for CRM than they are for ERP.
So this is very interesting. Almost any category in B2C or in B2B, you can now calculate how often people are buying. Once you understand how often people buy, you can then start to calculate how many of those people will buy in the next quarter or in the next year or in the next 5 years. And then you can spend your budgets accordingly. So this is where AI can do the work that previously took a PhD to do. AI can do it instantly for you and help you make better decisions today.
So first of all, you would have had to know the 95-5 rule because you would have had to read the book, which nobody read. Then you'd have to field a survey to figure out how to actually apply the 95-5 rule to your category. Now you have a pocket PhD. You have a PhD in your pocket who knows the 95-5 rule and knows what it looks like for your very particular category. This isn't like Byron Sharp in your pocket. It's Byron Sharp in your pocket with your data for your category. Trend number 6 is called the marketing finance interface. The truth is, over the past 10, 20 years, the world has become more and more financial. These days, there's a financial market for everything. Sneakers, watches, baseball cards, these things can now all be bought and sold like stocks in an open market. But the truth is, although the broader world has become more and more financial, marketers seem to be becoming less and less financial. And this is particularly true of brand marketers. Imagine you're a CFO and 2 marketers come into the room to pitch for budget. First, the performance marketers come in, and they come in with spreadsheets that look like this, Excel documents that talk about predicted cost per lead and revenue per lead and SQLs and MQLs, and it looks like math, it looks like finance. Then the brand marketer comes in the room and they've got their mood boards and their color schemes and their brand personalities. You know, most of the time you need like an MBA from Hogwarts to even understand what the brand marketer is trying to say, right? It's like CFOs are from Wharton, brand marketers are from Hogwarts, right? It should come as no surprise that performance marketers have gotten more and more budget and brand marketers have gotten less and less budget. And that's because brand marketers have not positioned what they do in a financial way.
AI is going to change that. AI is in particular going to help brand marketers because it's going to help brand marketers understand that you don't just have a PhD in your pocket that knows marketing, you have a PhD in your pocket that knows finance and can bring those two things together. So the PhD, the financial PhD, will understand how big is your market, how fast is your market growing, who are the key competitors in the market, what are the respective market shares, all the important financial information that brand marketers have traditionally not been very good at using or finding. What you see here is actually where this marketing and finance interface comes together. What we're looking at is really what we call mental market share. It's within a given buying situation, in this case, component overhaul, how much mind share or how often does your brand come to mind versus how often do other brands come to mind. And you can see once you start to understand how often you come to mind, you're no longer talking about brand awareness in a vacuum. You're talking about brand awareness in a specific situation. And if you win more market share in that situation, or mind share as we call it, how much can that be worth in financial value? So what you see here is a 1% gain is worth something like $33 million. So now imagine you go into your finance team and you say, we've got a big quarter ahead of us. We're going to be marketing component overhaul. We think if we do a good job talking about component overhaul, and here's what we know from our AI market research around what that actually means and what our customers need, we think we get $33 million out of that. That's where a brand marketer starts to speak like a financier. That's where it is a much better conversation, and you're going to win bigger budgets and have bigger teams and have more success. So using AI to build a finance and marketing interface, you can finally fight finance with finance. Now we're going to talk about trend number 7, what we call the million scenario machine. In any very serious, very rigorous, very quantitative industry, and marketing should become one, companies use Monte Carlo simulation. So they will simulate something 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times to understand what's actually going on or what's likely to happen. So for example, in finance, companies use Monte Carlo simulations to assess bank risk. And in the world of climate change, companies use simulations to understand climate risk. So this is a way to use simulations to understand, predict, and then try to reduce or mitigate risk. Marketing needs to bring more Monte Carlo simulations into its work. Now, there's some places where this does happen, probably on the product side, maybe to the degree it happens at all within the kind of marketing function it's happening within performance marketing, but it's definitely not happening in brand marketing. What's happening today is people are usually not even running research, but if they're running research, they're running one piece of research, and then they're making decisions on that.
So take segmentation and targeting, for example. Trying to figure out your ICP and who you should target and not target is a super high stakes decision. But think about the data that often powers that decision. Oftentimes, there'll be no data at all. More sophisticated marketers might run a proper segmentation, but a segmentation can cost $1 million and take a year. So you're only going to do that once. But with AI, you actually have the potential to run this simulation thousands of different times. So instead of running your segmentation once, you could run 100 or 1,000 segmentations to really get the best possible level of accuracy for that high stakes decision. And not only can you run one report 1,000 times, you could actually run 10 reports 1,000 times each. So you could run 1,000 different versions of your segmentation, 1,000 different versions of your brand positioning, 1,000 different permutations of your creative executions, and then actually figure out what combination of segments, positions, and messages is going to deliver the best financial return. This type of modeling is so complicated and so expensive, it used to be reserved only for the highest stakes decisions like landing a rover on Mars. Now it can come to everyday marketing decisions like what audience should I target? Our next section is around tactics, how you bring your strategy to life, and how you can now, with AI, get to market in 60 seconds. Trend number 8 is called the innovation game. Let me tell you a fun bedtime story about AlphaGo. Very early versions of AI from IBM were able to beat the best chess player in the world, Garry Kasparov. But it wasn't until fairly recently that AI was able to play a much more complicated game called Go. Go is much more complicated than chess because it has 1 million different moves and things are much more dynamic. It's a more wicked environment versus the kind environment of chess. So there was this big standoff where AlphaGo was playing the best human Go player in the world. And something very interesting happened, a sort of pivotal moment in AI called Move 37. Move 37 was a choice, a move made by the robot, by AlphaGo, that nobody could quite understand when it happened. The commentators thought it was a hallucination or an error. They thought that was such a strange move. There must be something wrong. And it turns out Move 37 is actually what allowed the machine to beat the man at Go. In other words, the machine considered a possibility that the human would never consider because it was too strange and too unusual. So there is this sort of meme in AI that AI is just a parrot. It can only regurgitate what's out there. It's incapable of doing new, novel things or novel ideas. Move 37 shows that's actually not true. Even the earlier versions of AI were capable of actually coming up with new ideas. Now let's talk about marketing. When it comes to marketing tactics, there's the famous 4 Ps, right? There's product, placement, promotion, and price. What you're able to actually do is AI can generate ideas across all 4 Ps, and they are not always obvious ideas. Sometimes they're actually very novel ideas. Like, let's talk about product, for example. Recently, a pharmaceutical company used AI to come up with an entirely novel drug that has now passed clinical trials.
A very simple place you can start when trying to turn up your innovation is starting with this idea of temperature. In lots of the big models, temperature is either 1 or it's 0. 1 would be as variant and crazy and wild as possible, and 0 would be no variance at all, very reliable, very stable. For certain decisions like market research, you want a low temperature. You really want to understand very factually what the market wants. For certain ideas like creative campaigns, let's call it, or maybe even different product ideas, maybe you want to turn the temperature all the way up to 1 and get a lot of crazy ideas. And this is a place where you can drive innovation by introducing variance. It's a very exciting way to kind of generate more ideas so that you can actually filter through the ideas and choose the ones that you like. We're fond of saying that quantity has a quality all of its own. And I would encourage you as a marketer to turn up the quantity, turn up the temperature to get more ideas and just choose the ones you want to test and then see if they work. I'm confident you'll get some innovative ideas in that way.
So take this example, which is about developing a new ERP product for construction and manufacturing companies. If you set this at a very low, predictable temperature, you might get an obvious idea, like a ProFlow scheduler that figures out how to align various parts of the supply chain to build maximum efficiency. If you set the temperature much higher, you might get a lot weirder, more interesting ideas. Like this idea of the phantom twin, of building a synthetic simulation or copy of a factory floor and messing around with every permutation to figure out how you maximize the efficiency of the factory. Or consider this in the promotional P, right? So if you ask it to come up with a tagline for your CRM campaign, at a low temperature, it might just say, hey, instant insights, at your fingertips, right? If you try a very high temperature example, you might see something like this. Your CRM just grew a pair of crystal balls. The point is, AI is not just a parrot. It's not just mimicking what's out there. It's actually able to combine different ideas from different disciplines in novel ways to come up with novel ideas, whether that's novel placements for your media, novel products that you could bring to market, novel promotional or advertising campaigns you could run, and even novel pricing strategies. Trend number 9 is called codified creativity. Now, when it comes to creative, most people think it's pure magic. There's no rhyme or reason or magical formula that will get you good creative. Jon and I beg to differ. Let's consider the case of Disney. Disney, probably the most successful creative enterprise of all time. Let's talk about 3 very famous Disney movies. You've got Finding Nemo, The Lion King, and WALL-E. Now, on the surface, you might say, oh, these are so original, brilliant, original works of art. But let's look under the hood for a second. What is Finding Nemo about? It's about a fish that gets lost at sea and needs to find its way home. What is The Lion King about? It's about a lion who gets lost in the jungle, needs to find its way home. WALL-E, not going to believe this, it's about a robot, gets lost in space, needs to find its way home. Actually, it's all vaguely reminiscent of this old story. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but it's a Greek guy who gets lost in Greece, needs to find his way home. I think it's called the Odyssey or something like that. So these appear to be highly original pieces of art. But if you actually look under the hood, what you'll find is that there's a formula, a formulaic approach that helps Disney reliably generate great creative. Now, this is true in marketing as well. The best marketing creative also has a code or a formula, and the best brands follow them religiously. So religiously that you actually can't even confuse the brands because they're so well managed. You see some examples here where we've taken the famous logo, we've tried to put the wrong name on the logo, but even when we do that, you still know that's Ford. That's Levi's, that's MasterCard, because these brands are so well managed and they do a particular good job of managing what Jenny Romaniuk would call their distinctive brand assets. So these are colors or taglines or characters that evoke the brand without actually saying the name of the brand. Now, when we were at the B2B Institute, Jon and I tried to measure the strength of distinctive assets across 5 different categories, and we looked at hundreds of different assets. And what we actually found is that most B2B brands don't have any distinctive assets at all. Most B2B brands are drowning in a sea of sameness. So every finance and tech brand are blue. Everyone's talking about higher ROI. Everyone's saying the same things in the same way so that they all blend in and nobody stands out.
Now, the way to codify your brand is what you see here. If you run a distinctive asset test, you can start to understand in cloud infrastructure, when I think of the color red, how much do I think of Oracle? Or when I think of people in the category, how much do I think of Larry Ellison? Or if I show you the Oracle word mark scrambled, do I know that it's actually from Oracle? And the more codified the word mark or the character or the color is, the more likely it is to be linked with you. And great brands are linked almost exclusively with their word mark or their character or their color. And that's what needs to happen. And the better you can do developing very distinctive, very codified codes, the better AI can interpret those codes and then produce ads on your behalf, which is what you see here. Coca-Cola had run the same Christmas ad for something like 27 years. And because the codes are so well codified, the scenes are so well codified, it's just the same thing over and over and over. AI could understand that and then reproduce the ad. And using AI, Coca-Cola had a very successful, very profitable, very low-cost ad. So that's the possibility of if you codify your codes, AI can interpret them and produce brilliance for you. Now we're going to talk about trend number 10, which we call hybrid intelligence. Everybody's trying to figure out right now, what should humans do and what should AI do? Should AI be the substitute for the human? Should AI be the complement to the human? Here you can see some data around doctors, and doctors making decisions alone, doctors making decisions with AI, and then AI making decisions alone. And the reality is that on this specific decision, the AI will make a better decision than the doctor. But of course, that's not true of all decisions. It's just this single decision.
Probably the most important thing ever said about AI over the past few years was actually contained in this brilliant tweet by Balaji, a very famous venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And what he says is that AI doesn't do end-to-end, it does middle-to-middle. And the new bottlenecks are actually prompting and verifying. This is a super, super important point. Some people think AI can do everything. Some people think AI can do nothing. And the truth is somewhere in between. It's that you got to have humans in the right part of the workflow. As a case study, let's talk about one of our favorite clients, ServiceNow. So ServiceNow wanted to build personas for its key audiences like CHROs, CIOs, and CTOs. And they wanted to partner with us, Evidenza, to do that with AI much faster and more cost effectively. But let's talk about what the humans did versus the machines. What the marketers at ServiceNow did is decide who the personas are and decide what type of information they really want to know about their personas. Like, what are the key category entry points? How are their jobs changing? What are their media consumption habits? So the marketer decided what should be in the actual persona cards. Then AI, Evidenza, took over. We handled the middle part of this. So we actually built a synthetic sample of CHROs, fielded all of these questions, aggregated the data, and then gave it back to them in slides. Then the humans came back into the process, where the marketers at ServiceNow took these persona cards to other people in marketing, people in sales, people in product, in order to verify and pressure test the information in the persona cards. So again, that's not AI end-to-end, it's AI middle-to-middle.
Now, keep in mind, this is about hybrid intelligence. We don't think AI is going to replace or substitute for people. And in fact, you can see this in history. I always think it's good to think about history and what's happened historically when technology has automated something. And what you see here is that, of course, when the ATM came in, people worried, well, the automated teller machine is going to remove or replace tellers. But in fact, that's not what has happened. Even though there are many, many more ATMs now, there's actually many more bank tellers as well. So there may be fewer tellers in every specific branch, but because there are many more branches, because productivity has made companies more successful and allowed them to grow, you see there are many more bank tellers. So automation doesn't mean substitution. Automation generally just means a complement. And that's what hybrid intelligence is all about.
And that is lab-grown marketing. Thank you for joining us to learn why machine-made marketing will actually be better, not worse, than man-made marketing. We covered the 10 synthetic advantages across the 3 core jobs of a marketer: research, strategy, and tactics.
Thanks for joining us, and please visit our website, evidenza.ai, to download the report. We'd love to hear your feedback. And of course, if you'd like help implementing these ideas, reach out to us. I'm John Lombardo. He's Peter Weinberg. And of course, we can help you to implement these at your organization. Grazie mille.